Hey everybody, just a quick note before we start the episode. I forgot to mention where all the items that Bob talks about are available, and that's on his website, robertgdavis.net. And you can also find it on the description notes below. Thanks for listening.
Three, two, one. Hi, I'm David Riley, and
I'm Nicholas Harvey.
we're three distinct knocks with our distinguished guests today, Robert G. Davis, who we will introduce more fully in a moment. And I'm really looking forward to talking to him about his new projects. He's going to educate us all. But first, as is traditional, our rant. Hello, brother. The word brother has a special meaning for me. It has ever since I turned 15 and joined the Order of Malay. It means guys like Jonathan Marcus, Mike Pacilio, Charles and Clay Stewart, and yes, even you, Travis Carlin. It means friends you can count on, guys who see you at your best and at your worst and still love you. People who would just sit next to you as you mourn and who would be the first to congratulate you when you celebrated. I'm somewhat older than 15 now, and those brothers still have a place in my heart. The word brother has become even more powerful to me as I've spent time as a Freemason. I've traveled many hours to bury a brother. I've sat with a brother as he talked about the possibility of proposing marriage. I've congratulated a brother as his first child was born. I have helped a brother explore care options for his ailing father. I've attended funerals. I've celebrated anniversaries. I've been a Mason long enough and have been active enough that I have several Masonic titles. The accompanying honorifics mean something to me when sometimes used in recognition of my service and efforts by someone whose respect I feel I've earned. For the longest time, however, being called worshipful made me uncomfortable. Being called excellent just made me laugh. But with time, the titles have come to seem natural in the appropriate context, and their power to make me cringe or to amuse me has faded. The power of the title brother has never faded. There's something in me that lifts when one of my brothers calls me brother. There is something in me that rejoices when I see one of my brothers. And that is perhaps why, of all the details that have been in the news about the recent tragedy in New Zealand, the one that has stuck with me is that the last words spoken by the first victim of the shootings, Muhammad Yaoud Nabi, were, "Hello, brother." The shooter, may his name be forgotten and his memory erased from history, replied with 3 bullets. I have been thinking a great deal about my brothers. My lodge is very diverse, like the Cambridge community in which it is situated. We have members from a wide variety of backgrounds, born in several countries, and of various races. And we have members who are Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and so on. If you are the sort of man who cannot be in a room with others who do not share your faith, and with an open heart pray with and for those men, then you have no business being a Mason, and I would ask that you not seek admission to our order. If, in a moment when we left our West Gate insufficiently guarded, you became a Mason, but reject the idea of the universal brotherhood of man under the universal fatherhood of God, I invite you to resign from Freemasonry. It cannot benefit you, and you cannot benefit from Freemasonry. My heart aches for my brothers who've been targeted in this latest bigotry, as it had ached before for other brothers. I do not know what I can do to help heal the hate that is in the world, except by continuing to uphold the ideal I learned at that altar in the Scottish Rite Cathedral in San Antonio, Texas, in Albert Pike chapter number 58 of the Order of Malay. That ideal that says we are brothers, and that means something. Hello, brother. And with that, hello, brother Bob.
Hello, Brother David. Well said. Well said.
Thank you, sir. I want our listeners to know a little bit about you. I would read your Masonic resume, but we try to keep these episodes to under an hour. So
Thank you. Thank you.
I will mention that you're the Secretary Emeritus of the Guthrie Scottish Rite Bodies. having served as executive secretary for 30 years. You're a past master of 3 Masonic lodges in Oklahoma, a 33rd degree Mason, and a recipient of the Grand Cross. You're the past Grand High Priest of Royal Archmasons in Oklahoma, past Grand Commander of the Knights Templar in Oklahoma, and you serve Oklahoma Masonic Rosicrucians as its chief adept. And you currently are serving as junior warden?
Senior Grand
Senior
Warden.
Grand Warden of the Grand Lodge of Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I think you're, and if people want to know more, they can certainly visit robertgdavis.net and click on the biography part. But your service to the fraternity has been exemplary in many ways, not the least of the which is your scholarly output, which I think is just amazing. And now that you've semi-retired, you've become even more prolific, haven't you?
Well, that's true, I guess. I've had the wonderful privilege of being a professional Freemason. So when you think about that, I got to spend 8 hours a day making a serious study of Freemasonry. Just like every other man in his own occupation, invest all of his time and energy to learn what he knows or what he needs to know about his own occupation, and it totally consumes him. And it's because of that he becomes successful in what he does, and as a result of that, becomes a success in life. So I'm no different than anybody else. It just happens to be that I was privileged to have Freemasonry as an occupation, and that's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful privilege, I must admit.
I think that's a very modest view. But let's talk about one of your earlier books real quick, very quickly, because I think some people are familiar with it, The Mason's Words, in which you try to give us a history of the development of American ritual. That book is available on Amazon, I know, and I think is available in a Kindle edition now, right?
Yes, I think it is. Yes. Uh-huh.
So, what did you discover in tracing the history of American Blue Lodge ritual that surprised you?
Well, I guess I should first of all say that I never intended for that to be a book. What I had a hunger for when I was a very young man was to know who wrote the language of the fraternity. I mean, we're given this charge to memorize all of these words. And if you do it, uh, the way you should, you end up memorizing something like 80,000 words. And and that was sort of the first quest I made as a young Mason. I thought, well, I cannot think about what things mean if I cannot bring the ritual into my mind. But then as soon as I accomplished that job, then I became very, very curious about where this stuff came from. How old is it? How long has it been in the system? Who authored it? And so I started investigating that and essentially writing a journal. Uh, and and I just sort of stayed after that as I had an opportunity to do that. And one day, after I had a couple of hundred pages of journaling, I noticed that this thing would this would sort of adapt itself into a book pretty easily. And so I kind of put it in book form. And all of this happened 20 years ago. And and then I didn't do anything with it because I was concerned that how can you write a book about the evolution of Masonic ritual without exposing the esoteric words of the fraternity? I was afraid Masonic charges would be brought against me, and so I just let it set. And then Masonic scholars that I came to know and respected, guys like Brent Morris and Rex Hutchins and Arturo de Hoyos, they kept convincing me that it is not considered a violation of your obligation if you cite something that someone else has exposed. if it's something that's in fact in the public domain. And I still wasn't convinced for a long time. But then in the last 15 years, a remarkable thing happened. Uh, you know, exposures became easy to find. Any internet search would take you to any Masonic ritual that you were interested in, and Grand Lodges became aware that the secrets that they thought that they were protecting all these years through the words were no longer secret at all. And so they started redefining, well, then what does secrecy mean if we've exposed all the words? And that, I think, that change in consciousness of the governing authorities of the fraternity gave me the courage to go ahead and publish the book. And it's been well received, and I'm glad I did. I'm not going to say it's the definitive work on the history of the Masonic ritual, but on the other hand, I think it covers all of the basics. And I think the thing that surprised me the most was how diverse the ritual has always been to the European Freemasons, and how insistent American Freemasons have always been to standardize it.
Mm-hmm.
And I even after three national efforts to standardize the Masonic ritual in America, all three of which failed, it's still something that many Grand Lodges simply feel that we have our adopted work and we're proud of it. We like it. We think it's as good as anybody else's, probably better than most. And so if you're going to be a Mason in our jurisdiction, you're going to love what we love. And yeah, and in a way, I think that's kind of regrettable because every time we journey to another grand jurisdiction and we watch Masonic work from another jurisdiction, it's a fascinating experience for us. It's something we love to do. The differences, the idiosyncrasies that are different among different ritual workings just add to our fascination with the words and with the purpose of the ritual. So I'm sort of of the school that I think every grand jurisdiction should have its adopted work, and most lodges within that jurisdiction should practice the adopted work. But my gosh, how wonderful it is to have a few specialty lodges in every state, or how wonderful it would be to have a few specialty lodges in every state that could work the ritual from various constitutions. The
Mm-hmm.
District of Columbia has proven how profitable that is. I think they're the only growing grand jurisdiction in the United States, and of course they live in the culture of the most diverse. I assume they live in the most diverse culture, perhaps the United States. But they have embraced that these differences in ritual actually increase the education that's available to a brother. So anyway, I think that was my biggest surprise is how varied the ritual is in our beginnings, and how standardized we tried to force it as Americans.
It's
How much is
interesting.
missing as well, right? Because even when you and I were speaking a couple months ago about something I had a question on, and you're just like, well, I don't know. And between you, Chuck Dunning, myself, and maybe four or five other people, we were trying to figure out where this one thing came from. And it's just, it didn't exist. And then there's like 25 years, and then we see it. And
Mhm.
that's all we have.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have discovered um, that the differences which exist between Masonic monitors across uh, the jurisdictions generally exist because somebody within their jurisdiction added something at some point to the standardized ritual that everybody just thought was brilliant, and they adopted it as a part of their workings. And so most of the variations we see in the ritual have to do with those little things that people have added that they just thought was cool. And maybe when things appear, that appear to be 30 years old, maybe that's exactly how it happened. Because the adoption of the ritual now is, as you well know, is strictly within the governance of every Grand Lodge. So there's no national judgment concerning the adoption of ritual. So
I would just think that in this day and age, someone could find some old minutes and some secretary said, Brother Joe Smith started talking about this pencil. We thought it was great. We're going to start using it.
yeah,
Maybe one day. Oh.
yeah, well.
I think one of the things that I think surprises a lot of Masons who don't have that experience of traveling from jurisdiction to jurisdiction is the first time they do, and they realize how different rituals in different jurisdictions can be. I think it really, everybody thinks their jurisdiction is the way it's done everywhere.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden they discover that Freemasonry is far more diverse and far more interesting than they presuppose.
I have a quick story about that. I was at Lodge last week, and this guy comes up to me, and he's wearing a white apron with a purple trim, and it's on the outside of his coat. And I go, you're from New Jersey. And he goes, how do you know? And I'm like, well, we wear aprons on the inside in Florida, and it's purple and white. And he's like, huh. And so we got to talking, and then we talked after Lodge, and he wanted to ask me something. And I was trying to dude, just say what you're trying to ask me. And as junior deacon, he was basically like, why'd you miss so many parts? And I was like, I'm pretty sure I was word perfect. I only have 13 words to say. And he's like, well, you forgot this part and this part and this part. I'm like, oh, yeah, we don't do any of that here. And he's like, what? I was like, I don't know, man. He's like, that's terrible. I'm like, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, when I visited, there was a group of us who were sitting around near this, and we were talking about ritual, and all of a sudden we started finding out how different people's ritual was, because we had a group of guys from various states. And finally I stood up and said, I'm from the oldest jurisdiction in the Western Hemisphere. If you do it differently than us, you do it wrong. And started to walk off, to stunned silence for a moment, and then gales of laughter. They took me as seriously as I deserved to be taken.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So let me ask you both to put on your past Grand High Priest cap for a moment. You recently issued some educational materials for the York Rite.
Yes.
And those, did you start with the materials that were available from peers and expand on them, or?
Yes, as you know, there's very little that's been written about the York Rite branch of the fraternity. We have Albert Mackey's, Guide to the Chapter and Council. Almost everything from an educational point of view is 19th century when it comes to York Rite, and that's a real shame, because the degrees of the chapter and council especially are esoterically sound. And what I mean by esoterically sound is that they have elements which are necessary to the hero's journey, or to a man's journey to the mature masculine, to his mature masculine self. And so they're not just words, they're words that have a great deal of meaning behind them, but no one in the 20th century has bothered to think about what the rituals of the York Rite really mean. And Piers Vaughn, past Grand High Priest in New York, who actually I think was the Grand High Priest the same year I was the Grand High Priest in Oklahoma, he wrote and published this wonderful guide to capitular masonry. And he gave me a copy of it, and I was just so elated to have that. It was just a quality piece of work, but it was also a piece of work that was only about the New York, um, chapter workings.
Mhm.
And I realized that the Oklahoma chapter workings were slightly different than the New York chapter workings. And both of our rituals are tied to the rituals of the General Grand chapter of Royal Arch Masons International. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we had uh, examples of differences or small variations in the rituals as a result of the way two different jurisdictions have adopted their work. And so that gave me an opportunity to add some of the Oklahoma workings to the New York workings. And then I also wanted to add additional esoteric considerations to the work that Pierce had done. And so, with his permission, we came out with a second, sort of a second edition of that work. The one that's used in New York, it's his authorship only, and the one that I use shows me as a contributing author to Pierce. And
Well, I have to say, I think that's one of the best things that's been published lately. We've been using Piers's work
mhm.
and Cambridge chapter. The new high priest really put an emphasis on rebuilding some educational program for chapter, and he's been using it in chapter, and it's been very well received by candidates. Very well received by candidates.
Yeah.
So when yours came out, I know he snapped it up immediately and started incorporating some of the additional material. It's and candidates are hungry for education. They want to learn, they want to understand, they want to feel the meaning behind the ritual. And
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons New York Rite struggles in many places is because that hasn't been widely available.
Mhm. Well, it, it's a generational gap too. It's a disconnect that is the result of young men coming into the fraternity not because their fathers were Freemasons and they were just joining the family legacy of the fraternity, which is, of course, is the way it was for 300 years prior to the Great Depression. They they're coming into the fraternity because what they have learned about Freemasonry from their researches on the World Wide Web, and they understand better about what Freemasonry is about than a lot of the men who have been active in lodges uh, for almost the whole of the 20th century, because those men only embraced the ritual of the fraternity. And so the expectations of the young men coming into the fraternity are entirely different than the expectations of the men who joined, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so what has happened is the older generation has felt real threatened because they realize they really don't know anything about Freemasonry other than its language. And to them, to know the language is enough. And they're afraid that somehow these young guys coming in will destroy them in some way because they know more about masonry than the old men. What the old men don't understand is that the young men are not concerned about so much about how much the masonry the older men know. That's not why they joined. They joined the fraternity to place themselves in a multi-generational male environment. And what they want and enjoy from these older men are their life experiences. They recognize that these guys have wisdom that they don't have simply because they've lived a lot more years. And I have never met a young man who's not enjoyed the conversations that old men have had about their own life experience. And so we really do have a match here. the older fellas, it's not that they have to be the most knowledgeable Freemasons. They just have to be willing to pass their life experience on down to the generations below them, which is exactly what men have always done, whether that is a matter of fathering your own son or whether that is a matter of being a father role model to the next generation below you. And one of the powerful things about Freemasonry is this intergenerational connection exists where knowledge and wisdom can be passed down from generation to generation, and mentorship can also be drawn from the younger generation to the older generation because cultures change, technology changes, the advances of science changes, information changes, and the young men can bring all that into the lives of the older men. And so we still have a wonderful match. And it's just right now we're sort of at that point where we need to embrace the fact that we need to let the young men take over the reins of our lodges and leadership positions as soon as they are able to do that. And then we in turn need to see ourselves as the elder of the tribe and try to simply provide guidance and stability as it's needed to ensure the continued progress of the whole. So
I have a sort of a funny story about that. My mother lodge has several tattoo artists who are members of the lodge who are very active. And there was a man, his name is Bill. He's passed away since this, unfortunately. But he was in his mid to later 80s and came to every single meeting of the lodge. He was never an officer, but was always a member on the sidelines and was very present. And he took off his jacket one day at dinner, and he happened to be wearing a short sleeve shirt under it. And there was this blurry panther crawling up his arm tattoo. And it,
Okay.
his skin had deteriorated, and the tattoo did not look so great. And one of the tattoo artists walked over to him and said something about, where did you get that tattoo? And probably was going to say something like, we can fix this up for you if you want. And Bill looked at him and said, "Oh, I got that the night before I shipped out to kill me some Nazis." And the brother looked at him and said, that may be one of the nicest tattoos I've ever seen.
yeah, right, yeah.
So you're right. I think it is one of the great benefits of Freemasonry is you get a diversity of community that you don't get as a man in other places. Not just intergenerational, but also between classes, between professions. A lot of men, their friends come from a narrow line of profession. They have work friends. They don't have much outside of that. And I think Freemasonry just gives you such a broad opportunity to, in what other universe am I friends with Nicholas? I got to meet him because he's a Mason. I would not have had that opportunity otherwise. I think you're right. And I think it's a really important point that the older generation doesn't have to fear the younger generation with more esoteric interests.
That's exactly right. And I think the younger generation can fill in some gaps that were never introduced to the older generation. And that has to do with this journey to manhood, this journey to mature masculinity. I do not believe that the older generation men ever fully understood that the progressive path that we make through the degrees of Freemasonry represents their own journey through life.
Right.
And unless they just were men who read what was available to them at the time, they may have not picked up on that. And so there's a whole dimension that's coming into the fraternity now because of the younger men's interest in the deeper meanings of things that older men are actually finding very fascinating. One thing that I have observed is we're trying to establish speakers bureaus in Oklahoma, and I know a number of other jurisdictions are doing that. And we're trying to make educational venues something that lodges can embrace, even though they may not have a resident scholar in place to carry that out. And almost invariably, as these lodges start doing these regular monthly education programs, they'll start out with just the faithful few attending, and they tend to grow, so that you may start out with 5 or 6 guys at the first of the year, and having done 12 of these over the course of a year, you may have 30, 40 guys attending lodge, only after 1 year. But the beautiful thing about that is that the older guys are embracing it as much as the younger men. So it's a new discovery for them. That's exciting to me.
That's a really good point, and that's something that I haven't heard someone point out, is that the older guys do embrace it after time, and that fits with my own experience too. There's both sides need to be open.
It eliminates their tension. Remember, their tension is they're concerned because they really fear they don't know much about masonry, and somehow they're going to be discovered. And it enables them to sit back and relax and say, I don't need to worry about this. Somebody else is taking care of the knowledge. And so I think that's working pretty cool.
So now your latest book, you can take off your past Grand High Priest hat and put on your Scottish Rite prayer cap. I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, but what's the title?
The title is The Journey of the Elu to Enlightenment, a contemporary interpretation of the teachings of the Scottish Rite.
Wow, you took on a challenge for yourself, didn't you?
Well, yes, but it was a challenge actually. This book is written in memory of and dedicated to Dr. Jim Tresner, 33rd degree Grand Cross, nationally known Masonic figure, one of the most respected Masonic scholars internationally. And just so happens that I had the good fortune of having him as a brother that not only belonged to my lodge, but also belonged to my own Scottish Rite Valley. And when I was asked to become the secretary of the Guthrie Scottish Rite bodies, I was the city manager at the time in a city in north central Oklahoma, and I accepted that. I knew how important it was to bring Jim Tresner from that same city in north central Oklahoma to Guthrie, and try to make him a consultant to the fraternity, and that's exactly what I did. So Jim became the director of the degree work in the Valley of Guthrie about the same time that I became the administrative director of the Valley. And so we were able to take the Scottish Rite to a place that most valleys do not get to experience it, and the reason we were able to do that is that the Guthrie Valley has one of the most beautiful temples, in all of Freemasonry. Most people would argue it's in the top 3 of Masonic edifices in the country. We had a legacy of conferring all 29 degrees, the 4th through the 32nd degree, every year. And we've been doing that since 1917. And so we had an experience that 85% of the valleys in the southern jurisdiction, I assume probably the northern jurisdiction, did not experience. I just don't know. In my own experience, I don't know that there's very many valleys that have always conferred all 29 degrees of the work. So
And it's
that,
more, sorry, not to interrupt, but it's more than just doing the 29 degrees. The temple is gigantic. It's like the size of a shopping mall. It has dorm rooms on site where people fly in from around the country and just stay the whole week. It's like summer camp.
yeah,
Nobody goes to sleep. It's it's the greatest thing I've ever been.
it's a great pilgrimage of men. And after all, pilgrimage is what we're all about.
It's
And
the mecca of Scottish Rite.
yeah, but what Jim and I wanted to do is we wanted also to make education available. Not only the experience of witnessing the degrees themselves, but a venue whereby we could discuss what the meanings of the degrees are. And so we were able to create member education venues, candidate education venues. Chuck Dunning got enthralled with the work that we were doing. He became a member of our valley, and because he's a contemplative Freemason and he knew that we would embrace that aspect of the work as well, we established the Academy of Reflection. And so uh, we have had the good fortune of putting in place almost all of the venues that men are looking for in one place, for that experience. And so that was a so I so over a course of years, of course, we've written a lot of things about the degrees, um, and Chuck has contributed to that. Jim contributed to it. I contributed to it. Other members of our education committee contributed to it. And it got to the point where it was hard to remember exactly whose words were written when. And so when I decided to write this book, I uh, I sort of acknowledged the fact that these words are not my own. These words are the collective words of the intellect of men that have been paying attention to the journey of the Scottish Rite in this valley, for the last 30 years. And so the other thing I wanted to accomplish is we have the same disconnect in the Scottish Rite as we do in the Blue Lodge, and that is that the settings of our degrees, the archaic language, the biblical costumes, the pageantry. Um, it's easy for men to acknowledge that, boy, those are beautiful words. Uh, that must have really meant something in its day. It's hard for men to understand that these rituals mean as much today as they did, back when they were originally put together. It's the same problem we have in the Blue Lodge. Men embrace the beauty of the language, but do they really integrate the meaning of the language into themselves? And until they reach the point where they do that, it's very, very difficult for them to improve themselves in Masonry, to become transformed by the experience of the fraternity. And of course, that was especially evident in the Scottish Rite, where you're presenting 29 degrees over the course of 3 days, and it's like shooting water out of a fire hose, and these guys all see it as very beautiful stuff, but when they leave, they don't know for sure what they've seen and what they haven't seen. So it seems to me that there has always been a need for us to provide a contemporary interpretation of the essential teachings of every degree in the Scottish Rite, so that when a man reads these lessons or these interpretations in each of the degrees, he can see immediately how these teachings can apply to him today. And so that's the hope of this book, is that every man can read it and say, "Oh yeah, now I understand what the moral or ethical um, lesson is, and the fact that it is timeless. And so that was the motivation for writing it.
Dr. Tresner, I don't have to tell you what an extraordinary character he was, what a larger than life presence he was.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I met him, and I only met him briefly twice, I walked up to him and I said, Dr. Tresner, my name is David Riley. I owe you an apology. And he said, I'm not going to try to imitate his speech, but he's, whatever for, young man. And I said, well, if you go and you talk to any candidate who has gone through amicable lodge in the last 3 years or so, and ask them the difference between truth and a fact, you're going to hear your own words coming back at you.
That's right.
And that's because I've been teaching it that way without attribution for quite some time. And so I feel I owe you an apology for not having acknowledged. And he said, you don't have to apologize for that. Why, I'm quite flattered.
That's right. Yeah.
There was a generosity about the way he offered instruction to people that was really quite remarkable and very, very inspiring. So I'm thrilled that you're doing something to memorialize that.
Mm-hmm. He was a very humble man. Very humble man. And he was a man who believed that we should all share our knowledge to anyone who's interested in receiving it. He's not the sort of fellow that wanted to keep his knowledge to himself so that somehow everybody knew that he was more brilliant than everybody else. He wanted everybody to know what he knew. And so a wonderful role model, for a Freemason in that regard.
Absolutely.
So both of you guys were in Oklahoma together.
Yes.
And because I met him again once, and it was just, I can't even put it into words. And I can't imagine how the universe put both of you guys in Guthrie, Oklahoma.
I know. Yeah, it was kind of divine intervention, I think, because Jim and I were so different in terms of our personalities, and we didn't even socialize together. But for some reason, you could put us together in front of a group of men in lodge, and we could feed off of each other as effectively as any two guys on the planet. And we discovered that at a fairly young age, and so we very much enjoyed doing that together.
I think it is proof that the grand architect has plans. That Guthrie was blessed with the two of you. I think that the effort to create a better version of the educational material that you've been using and make it available to everyone is really very generous on your part, and because I think that's part of what attracts people to Guthrie is that piece.
I agree, and education, as you've said, is attracting a whole generation of men, and so having written education courses for the York Rite, and now an education course for the Scottish Rite. In my journey in the Grand Lodge, I am presently writing an education course for the Symbolic Lodge. And what I'm hoping to be is the bridge builder. I want the older guys to facilitate education, and I know that the only way they're going to do that is to have a step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of approach. Here's the material. Here's your facilitator's guide. Here's the steps you follow. Just do these things, and I guarantee you there will be guys out there in the chairs that will participate in the discussions that result from that. So if we can do this for all the bodies in Masonry, we will have served Masonry well. And it's about the last thing my generation can do. So.
Don't you say that like you're going somewhere. You have a lot of work to do.
You can say that again when you've completed the educational material for the Grand College of Rites. So I do think that one of the things that when we started doing this podcast, we said we wanted to do was to provide education opportunities to Masons who are isolated, either because they've moved away from their lodge or because they don't feel like they're getting the educational opportunities that they're looking for in their lodge, and they want the opportunity to start something. And I think your work provides them that chance, which is why I wanted to highlight, that you're doing it for the York Rite, you're doing it for the Scottish Rite, and we can very much look forward to your work on it for the Blue Lodge. I think it's a beautiful opportunity that these Masons who are in areas that don't have access, unfortunately, to a Dr. Tresner or to you or to whoever it is in the various lodges that are strong in education. They can pull in these materials and they can start working with it. And what you discover is that, brothers that come with an open heart and an open mind to an Masonic education can contribute even without specific knowledge.
Yes.
And they start finding that there's wisdom in themselves. And I think that can be a really beautiful, empowering experience for young men.
That's exactly right. And when young men have the courage to express themselves, and other men that they know embrace that expression, those expressions in a very positive way, what that does, it affirms for that young man that he's at least on the right path. He's thinking about the right things. He's working on himself in the right way. And so, it increases his insights about his study of himself. And so, yeah, and of course, that's where the brotherhood comes in. But I wanted to say that the curriculum for the college, the consistory, which we've had for quite some time, is in a way is included in this book. We don't have multiple choice exams because the Master Craftsman program sponsored by the Southern Jurisdiction Scottish Rite has done a splendid job with those exams. But what I did do was I added a series of discussion questions at the end of each of these degrees, 10 to 15 of them. And so it's hoped that, guys, that if all they have is just the book and they want to talk about the 26th degree, they can read the 4 or 5 pages about the essential meanings of the 26th degree, and then there'll be 10 or 15 questions they can just throw out and discuss with each other. So I'm hoping that will also be a way that this book can be an education guide, a study guide, as well as an education. So
that's a wonderful model. My lodge has had something. It's changed forms over the years several times, but we call it the amicable colloquium, and it's an extra meeting that with the intent of education. It's gone through. Some years it's been very much focused on a book or a series of books. We went through a period where we were trying to get guys to read a book a month. That was a little ambitious. But what we found is that the hardest part of doing it well is to have a good plan for the discussion, how to get it going, and really thinking that through. So providing discussion questions is a great help for somebody who's trying to do this for the first time and isn't confident.
And I've tried to be really careful not to just simply duplicate some other wonderful work that's going on. Art de Hoyos is, bless his heart, he is taking the archives that have been very much hidden, in the Mother Supreme Council of the World all these years, and he's coming out with these books every year that have been so enlightening to us. And so, we now know more about the history of the Scottish Rite than we've ever known. because of guys like Art de Hoyos. And so I'm not going to talk about the history of the Scottish Rite here. I'm going to talk about what influenced the beginnings of the Scottish Rite, why it's a vehicle, for the transformative art. I do a chapter on what is enlightenment, what is freedom, and what is toleration, because these are the three great principles um, upon which progress is built, and they're fundamental and foundational to the Scottish Rite. And then I explain that there's six major themes in the teachings of the Scottish Rite, as long as well as quests within each of the four bodies of the Rite. And so you need to know the quest and thematic journeys that you're involved with here. I gave a real brief historical timeline of the chronology of the degrees, which I took from Brother Art. And then once that's done, that's part one of the book. And then part two, we just start with the Lodge of Perfection, and we explain the principal purpose of the Lodge of Perfection, and we begin with the fourth degree, and we go through all of the all the degrees of the Scottish Rite from there forward, and then sort of at the end, it's kind of a final chapter on where are we going, and so I think it fills a gap in Scottish Rite literature that has not been printed, and I hope that it'll be. I hope that brothers will find it worthy. It's something that Jim and I, talked a great deal about. Spent a lot of years studying and communicating about, many conversations. So this book is really a lot about putting in writing the things that Jim and I have talked about for a long time.
I think that cannot help but be transformative to the craft. So I think you've really done a great service. So I have an answer to this. This is a very naive and slightly off-topic question. And I have an answer to it, which was the topic of one of our rants. But since we've talked about the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, I think I know what you're going to say when I ask you this. But I get asked all the time, what should I do, Scottish Rite or York Rite? What should a guy do?
What should he do? Oh, what should he do first? And how quickly after he gets raised should he join? Let's really get controversial.
Well, I think overall, every serious student of Freemasonry needs to belong to the York Rite and the Scottish Rite, because those two organizations were created simply for further light in Masonry, further Masonic education beyond the lodge. And since it is so obvious that the third degree of craft Masonry ended with an unfinished story where something was lost and a substitute was given with some sort of promise that someday you may discover, what was lost, and then that was the last degree of Freemasonry. How are you supposed to discover that without any further information or education? And so it was always obvious, I think, to the authors of Freemasonry that they never intended the third degree to be the last degree of Freemasonry. They intended the third degree to be the first of the higher degrees of Masonic philosophy. And so I advise men to experience the York Rite first before the Scottish Rite, because the York Rite's degrees are conferred in the lodge setting from which they were raised and they're already familiar with, and the teachings of the chapter and council, as you know, stay very true to the story of the symbolic degrees, the craft lodge degrees. And so to me, it's it's the easiest bridge to cross over. Is just to go from the third degree to the chapter degrees. And the Scottish Rite, of course, then is clearly the university course in Freemasonry. It goes much deeper in its breadth and depth of philosophy. It covers a lot of traditions and themes of knowledge that the York Rite does not cover. And so it's just a continuation of your journey if you really want to make the study of your life something that is near and dear to you, which I think most men should be engaged with. So, how quickly I I disagree with these guys that say, "Oh no, you need to stay in the Blue Lodge for 6 months or a year. You need to go through the chairs before you experience any other body of masonry." That's just nonsense. Uh, if the objective and the quest of masonry is for a man to discover who he is, then he has to learn how to overcome himself. He cannot do that without awakening his consciousness. And if he awakens his consciousness, then he's going to have to encounter the ruffians within himself in order to overcome himself. It'll be the hardest challenge he ever takes on in his life, and yet it is so essential if he is ever going to affirm himself in his own skin. Every man makes that journey. Some men are not as successful at it as others, and the world is full of examples of men who never learned how to be men. And so it takes all of this. It takes all of the education that we can get. It takes all the guideposts. It takes all of the great truths from the past. It takes the experience of generations of living, for us to take this path on ourselves and to do it in private conclaves of men whom we can trust, in a safe culture of guys that are doing the same thing together. And we're the only organization in the world that offers this for men. And so I just, it's just, I just can't imagine someone stopping at the Master Mason degree and saying that's enough. Uh, so I think it's important to go through the chapter and council degrees of the York Rite. I think it's important to go through the Scottish Rite, and I think it's especially important if you go through the Scottish Rite to join a valley that confers um, a number of the degrees of the Scottish Rite.
And if not, they're always welcome to contact Guthrie and come out for a weekend. When do you guys do the 29 degrees?
We
About what
always
time of
do
year?
those the first weekend in April.
Okay.
I mean, once every seventh year, that might be Easter, so we might move it off. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
it's always the first weekend in April. And
I,
there's
I
other
think
valleys. There's other valleys across the southern jurisdiction that are now doing all 29. So we're not the only place to come. It's just that we do have that wonderful advantage of having the hotel located within the facility, and not much else going on in this town of 10,000 population. So you get to spend the weekend doing nothing but masonry. Yeah.
well, even if you leave the building and go to grab a quick lunch, everybody in the town is like, "Oh, you're here for the Scottish Rite degrees. How is it going?"
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I know.
The staff at Arby's was asking me how the degrees were. So yeah, I do have to say this is my personal bias. I think the experience of Guthrie, even if you've seen all 29 of the degrees, the Guthrie, there is something special about the experience. The degrees are put on as well as they possibly can be by, a group of amateur actors. Um, and the setting is just amazing. The educational opportunity, not just during the degrees, but by meeting your brethren who have come to see those degrees. It's just an amazing, uplifting, affirming experience for the serious Mason.
Mm-hmm.
I can't recommend it enough.
Yes, and it's I mean, We usually have between 600 and 700 men register for that event each year. And as you say, they come from a lot of different places. So it also gives you a new perspective about what the Fellowship of Men is. You know, it kind of gets you beyond whatever your culture is that you've been in and say, hey, this is pretty cool. New bunch of guys, some that have the same value system that I have. And
it turns out there are men in California that I have something in common with. Who knew?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you are one of my favorite people to talk to about Freemasonry. If there is any doubt in it at all, I love you, and I think you are, having the opportunity to call you a friend and brother is one of the treasured honors that Freemasonry has given me. But I don't want to keep you up past your bedtime, which I understand is now 6 p.m. Is it? And so I think we should start to close down. Is there anything else that you want to add?
Well, no, just I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed getting acquainted with you, David. You're one of those men that I would have never met if it hadn't been for these regional or national venues that where people come together, and you're just doing a tremendous job yourself at engaging men in this journey and finding the best that is within them. And you're a natural conversationalist, natural facilitator, and so I love you. And of course, Nicholas, what can I say? He's my tech guy.
You have to love him because your website will go down otherwise.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was kind enough to put the few books that I've written on the website. And then I just happened to mention that, I've written some other essays over a period of time that, you could add to that if you wanted to. And he comes back in about 20 minutes later and he says, do you realize there's 65 of these or something?
Yeah.
Amazing, So he's also put those on there. And I've had guys tell me they very much enjoy reading those.
Yeah, well, the only reason Three Distinct Knocks exists is because of Nicholas's amazing ability to nag.
Yeah.
So he was like, well, you said you wanted to do this. Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. And finally I gave in and did it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you, brother Nicholas. It's, it takes you away from the baby and everything else. But, and it looks like you just sit back mainly and listen, but, it wouldn't happen without you.
Yeah.
Well, the truth is that baby is 4 months old now. So I expect her to be running that household by another 2 months or so, right?
She does. She does.
Yeah, she's on the Jessica plan for taking over the world.
Yeah, there's been a few conversations where I've asked Brother Bob for some help with something Masonic, whatever that I was researching, and I mentioned the baby, and he's like, fatherhood. I'm like, leave me alone. I'm so tired. He's like, it's one of the greatest. I'm like, shut up.
That's right. The code of man. Fatherhood's the code of man. Yeah.
The code of man.
Yeah.
All right. So
I think it does begin like when they're 6 months. Yeah. You got to get to that helpless stage. That is tough, but
man, my wife is such a trooper. Gosh.
Yeah.
I can't thank her enough.
She would have to be. She married you.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, David, look forward to seeing you maybe in a few weeks in Cambridge.
I look forward to that, yeah. And let me know if there's anything I can do to make your travels easier.
Just let me know. Do I fly into Logan? Does that sound right?
That is correct.
Okay, I'll get that. That.
Aaron, if you contact our excellent high priest, Aaron, he'll take care of you. The fantastic photography on our website is courtesy of Brother Aaron Sherman. Our theme song was composed by worshipful Christopher Duggan. Our website is maintained, curated, and lovingly tended by Brother Nicholas Harvey. Essential canine supervision is provided by Raksha. Tattoos on David Riley are courtesy of Joe Boo from Chameleon Tattoo in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Many thanks to our Patreon sponsors.
I
You
have
are
the
all
list.
awesome.
I have the list.
All of you, even those of you whose names we can't pronounce.
I have the list. Charles Ward, Bill Strutner, Adam Roth, Amicable Lodge, Joseph Schlocklick, Arthur Schlittling, who gave me a baby gift, a gift to my child.
Aww.
Thank you. No idea who this man is. Thank you for the gift. Patrick Harvey, Christopher Patty, Masonic Revival, fossilbluff.com. Use code 3DK for 20% off. Aaron Sherman, Robert Patterson, Lou Demenich, David Vogel, and I don't know anybody else we're missing.
If we missed you, we apologize. We do appreciate you. The opinions expressed in this podcast on our website are those of the individual contributors and do not represent the opinions of any lodge, Grand Lodge, or other Masonic body. Please visit our website at 3distinctknocks.org. You can follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm David Riley, and I'm incredibly thankful for the brothers like Brother Davis that have made this podcast and my Masonic journey so rich, challenging, interesting, and fulfilling. I hope 3 Distinct Knocks has helped you make some daily progress in Freemasonry. Thank you for listening.